I need to start off by speaking about different methods of working, and it will help to understand why I proceed in the way I do. When I studied at Animation Mentor, the method for working that I ran across most often is the same that seems to be the industry standard, which is pose to pose. The idea is that the animator builds up poses one by one to tell the story, and then keeps adding poses until he either has enough poses for animation, or else is ready to use the computer's interpolation between poses. One very clever use of the pose-to-pose method was in Wreck-It Ralph, when the 1980s video game characters moved in a sort of jerky style, mimicking an 8-bit video game. This is animation that was done using the pose-to-pose method, but that was left intentionally blocked and unsmoothed. They tried it in the Lego Movie as well, though in my opinion, not as successfully. I saw great value in the pose-to-pose method, especially when I started seeing people use it very well. But being the independent thinker that I am, I didn't love the pose-to-pose method for me. It just didn't match the way I thought about animation. Over my time at Animation Mentor and beyond, I began to develop my own method, and now I've got that method to a point where I can talk intelligently about it. One thing I started finding out is that other people used a method very similar, if not identical, to mine. Though evidently the minority, there have been and still are a large group of animators who use a layered method, which is to say that they animate one joint at a time, on through the entire body. I don't call my method layered, because even though I do essentially work through layer to layer, I am very intentional about how I handle each layer. I call my method animating to extremes, and it came out of both my working through Animation Mentor, as well as my reading, thinking, and dialoguing about it with many animators who are very excellent, and with whom we happen to disagree. Now I have to clearly define what I mean by extremes, and it even took me quite a while to grasp this concept, which is outlined by Richard Williams in the Animator Survival Kit. There is what is called a keyframe, and a keyframe is sort of the storytelling pose of the animation. So in my baseball player example, a keyframe might be the player preparing for the windup, followed by winding up, followed by beginning to swing, followed by contact with the ball, followed by swinging through, followed by looking at where the ball went, followed by beginning the next action of the run. And it could be argued another half dozen keys in that action. In animating to extremes, I look at the furthest or highest point of the action and try to get my stopping points at those extremes. So in swinging the bat, there are only 4 extremes: the beginning of the windup, the highest point of the windup, the end of the swing, and the rest or movement toward the next action. That all comes with a caveat, and it's an important one. The extremes for each joint do not come on the same frame, and I go into this a little bit on my bird flight animation tutorial. The root, in our baseball player the hip, hits its extremes 1, 2, 3, or 4 frames before the belly, which hits before the chest, which hits before the biceps and neck, on and on. If we don't offset these extremes, our action will be incredibly stiff, and this is one of the reasons why the principle of overlap is so incredibly important. It's also one of the things that makes my method very difficult, and I have to warn everyone about this. Neither pose to pose nor animating to extremes is a joke. They are both very difficult. But in my method, the goal is to think of many frames at a time, rather than to stop and completely concentrate on a pose at each keyframe. It's very hard, and I promise you that many people will not like this way of working. But let's look at a few very simple examples to clarify this. In animating the bouncy ball on the computer, almost no one that I'm aware of animates pose to pose. A pose to pose method would mean moving the ball and setting a keyframe at the points the animator considers to be keys. Perhaps several keyframes at the high point of the arc, perhaps a key when the ball hits the ground, and possibly a key right before and right after the impact. Then in a proper pose to pose method, the animator would either keep adding more keyframes of the ball in place, or else go to spline, where he'd wrangle with the computer to get the in-betweens working. But most people who have even a few weeks training in animation have found that there is a simpler way to animate the bouncy ball, and that way is animating to extremes. In my example, I've only got 2 keyframes for X, which is where the ball starts and where it stops. I've pulled the tangent of the stopping point out just a little to make the ball slow down as it comes to a stop. Then the Y position, we see its extremes at the top of its arc and whenever it hits the ground. After Effects makes it a bit confusing because the high points of the Y are lower on the graph. That might take a little getting used to. But as many have pointed out, the graph looks very much like the bouncy ball itself. Now this brings about one of the great advantages of working to extremes. I have little data, so I can make edits quickly. I can pull tangents on Y to add more hang time. I can pull X's endpoint out further to make it roll later, or higher to bring the ball further or less far across the stage. I can scale down Y to get more of a bowling ball, and I can get all sorts of character traits in this ball as I play around all day. My next example is the arm swing, and here I want to especially point out the importance of making the root work. This becomes one of the hardest parts of animating to extremes, though in an example like this it's relatively easy. We know from our reading that in a walk cycle, the shoulder will tend to go up and down, thus creating a figure 8. So we start with that, and it can be a bit tricky to do using an X and Y translate, but eventually we figure it out. X is going to its extremes, which fortunately happen to repeat really nicely. Then Y, in its up and down motion, completes the figure 8. It's important, but sometimes difficult in a cycle to make sure that the end of the cycle links smoothly with the beginning of the cycle. Then comes the rotation, and this is a perfect example of where that overlap can become tricky, because the arm is going to continue swinging outward a few frames after it has translated outward. How many frames later will help determine how flappy of an arm it is. So the extremes of the arm's rotation follow the extremes of the arm's translation. One trick I've used in this case is to extend the arm's rotation beyond what I will actually render, and then copy and paste the ends of its motion back to the beginning. It works sort of like a pickup note in music. Now, many times you will hear people say that the computer is a lousy in-betweener, and there are some really important reasons for saying that. But because of my animating to extremes, you can perhaps see why I've said it's a wonderful in-betweener. By simply converting my extreme keyframes to tangents, or easy ease in After Effects, I have really fluid motion, and I can edit just by dragging the tangents if I want an action to go faster or slower or to hang longer. Now the root is done, and getting the root right is crucial to getting the rest of the body correct. It's like the foundation of a building. The more correctly you've dug and laid concrete, the more surely everything else will rest on it. It also happens to be very difficult, as we'll see in a moment. For in my case, my little 2D 3-joint animation, I only have 3 graphs to worry about. An X and a Y curve, whose extremes happen to coincide with each other nicely, and a rotation graph, whose curve is only slightly offset. It's not so simple in many animations, and certainly not in 3D, where there are, at the very least, translates and rotates, each in 3 dimensions, and typically many more controls. It's my theory that many people do not work this way simply because it's too hard to imagine how it's all going to work out. I know that I myself struggle a great deal to get it right. Just to round this off quickly before going to the baseball swing, I'll point out that the forearm and the hand only have one graph, which is rotation, and each extreme is offset from each other by 2 frames. There's a beautiful simplicity to working this way, and that's one of the reasons that I like it so much, although it's not the most important reason. I'll get to that later. Now let's turn to our baseball player. For my reference, I was able to pull out sketches and figure out what I wanted my poses to look like. I'm not going to build these poses in the computer, but I'm going to use them as reference to find out if I'm getting close and to make adjustments when those poses are not coming through. What I'm looking for is extremes. And as I study the hip, I see a pattern that I want to try and duplicate. It leans back to put weight on the hind foot, then it swings around to accommodate the swing of the bat, and then it returns to rest or begin the next action of the run. As I said, this is really hard to do. You're moving the hip around and trying to visualize where the feet are going to go in accordance. That's hard enough. Sometimes I hide the legs and just put the feet in place so I can see if they are properly supporting the hip. Then I have to swing the hip far enough so that the body will follow and work through this forceful action without being too extreme. I'm trying to picture an end result here that doesn't actually exist yet. Now, the real truth is that I have to go back and adjust that root many times even as I'm working through the other joints. But the more closely I can nail it the first time, the more easily everything else works out. I've built the foundation correctly. Here on the graph are my hips extremes. I've got 3 translates in X, Y, and Z, and 3 rotates in X, Y, and Z. I'm not even bothering with scales of any kind. The extremes are the beginning of the action, the height of the windup, the far end of the swing, and the return to rest or beginning of the next action. There are a few additional keys in there for adjustment, and not every graph has the same point on every extreme, but that's the basic pattern. Now in this case, there is no offset in these extremes. The hip is rotating and translating on all 3 dimensions at exactly the same time. We can get very interesting results by offsetting some of these translations and rotations, but that also makes the job that much harder. I want to pause for a second on the second extreme, the height of the windup. Something I recently learned that I felt like a fool for not knowing is that I did not properly understand the terms ease in and ease out, as Frank Thomas and Ollie Johnston define it in their book The Illusion of Life. I thought it meant slowing down and speeding up, and I couldn't figure out why that wasn't just lumped in with timing and spacing. Even Sento Lodigiani's wonderful video defines it that way, and he essentially uses the same example twice. But when Thomas and Johnston describe it, they mean hitting a pose and then easing into a stronger version of the same pose. They equate this with what they call a moving hold, which I've also heard different definitions for. That's what's happening here. I've hit a pose, but I'm slowly and softly moving into a different version of the same pose. It's one reason a lot of us use copied pairs. One other thing I want to point out as I'm on this hip, and that is how I've adjusted it along the way. You'll see if I look at each of these curves one by one, I've added some keyframes in between my extremes to either clarify or else otherwise adjust by animation. The problem is that will often make my action stop right in the middle of it, and I typically don't want that to happen. So why should my y-axis of my hip rotation suddenly slow down right in the middle of his swing and then pick up again? Almost certainly it won't do that, and even when I scrub through it looks a little hitchy. Clearly I put that in there perhaps for another rotation variable, in which case I got this unwanted one for free, or else I was just confused, either of which could be the case. Either way, I don't want it there, but honestly I'm not always going to know that until I've worked through every other joint. I don't always clean up like this, but on the root I tend to get it as clean as I possibly can. Again, it's the foundation of my building, so it should be strong. Typically, if I've worked the way I want to, my root will come out looking the cleanest of all, and everything will be smooth between extremes. I don't have to adjust the tangents very much, except I'll maybe drag tangents outward right before a fast action to really increase the speed of the action. But again, here I call the computer a wonderful in-betweener, and I am amazed at how much work it does for me. Now the root done, the other parts of the body are easier, especially because from waist up, everything else is basically just a rotate. In the belly, I'm going to go ahead and keep this beginning of the wind up, even though it's a bit stop and start and not completely smooth, because I know it's going through that pose and resting on it for a while. Over here it looks like I needed to get rotate Z to come in faster, but it's messed with my rotate X in a way I probably don't want. Let's get rid of it, scrub, and see. Yeah, that's weird. Why would it stop rotating in the middle of its returning to rest like that? I'm going to get rid of this. Clean up the chest. Smooth out the shoulders. Then carry through for the elbows and wrists. And in my case, his right wrist is controlling the bat. So I've set that wrist to be several frames behind the elbow because I want the bat to have some weight. Now there's a lot going on here with constraints to the bat, IK and FK switching that I'm not going to go into. I'm trying to communicate the basic principle. The foot that moves is a bit tricky, but notice how once I switch to FK to get it off the ground, the leg is going to be led by the hip joint, then the knee is going to follow the hip, and the ankle follows the knee. This gives us some really nice overlap as that foot leaves the ground, and then as it comes back. All the while I'm checking through my poses. This is my favorite one here. If I want to see something happening that isn't happening for my video or drawings, I'll go ahead and make adjustments to individual frames. To do so, I lock off the frame or frames before and after, and then adjust simply the area that I want. But I have to do that surprisingly little, because if I've got that root really working properly, the rest of the body seems to fall into place and follow its natural course, which means that in a sense I get my poses for free, though certainly not for real free. Nothing is free in animation. The last point I want to bring out is how easy edits can be using this method. Say I want my guy to stand wound up a little bit longer, so I can build the tension. I highlight all the related keyframes, and I just drag them out. Or say I want his swing to be faster. Again, taking all those keyframes, I just scale them in together, and I get a faster swing. The point is that it's easy to find which keyframes are relevant, and thus know where to select to make modifications. And that pretty much shows everything I wanted to. But before I'm done, I want to wrap up by talking about the advantages and disadvantages to working this way. The first advantage is fluidity. Since my eye has gotten better, I've begun to notice some very good pose-to-pose animation that just doesn't have the full fluidity in place. The second advantage is that edits are really easy. I can speed things up, drop things out, and quickly identify problem areas by working this way. The third advantage is that I feel like I'm working in harmony with the computer to get the result that I want. Like my dad used to say, let the saw do the work. I feel like this is a good combination of thinking like an artist and like a computer at the same time. The fourth advantage is, as I've mentioned, I get my poses and even my arcs for free. Look how nicely my bat swing itself turned out, the simple and nice arc, and there are only 2 keyframes in just about every case from the hip upward to get that. It just follows its own natural action. But my favorite advantage of working this way is that it's the way I think about animation. I have great honor for those who see animation happening in poses, but I am always watching both live motion as well as animation as going from one place to another, and that's why animating to extremes really makes sense to me. Now there are many disadvantages to it, probably enough to keep many of us from it. The first is that it's hard to find those poses you're looking for until you've got quite far into it. You don't know if you're going to get the result you want for some time, and it can be a bit scary. The second is like it. Using this method is risky. If something isn't working out, the animation can look like a hot mess, and often it's not very fun to fix. The third disadvantage is that sometimes I feel my work is too perfect, either mechanical or otherwise not very living. I feel like I'm sort of painting by numbers, calculating everything, and not allowing the work to really breathe. I've seen many a pose-to-pose animator start off with something that wasn't very fluid, but boy, there was something alive in it, even at the early stages. The fourth disadvantage is huge, and that is that I don't think my method would be embraced in the studios. I know studios are set up as pose-to-pose, and there is a very good reason for that. I don't think I could get away with, I ain't got nothing to show till Thursday, but trust me, it's gonna be good. So if I ever did end up at a studio other than my own, I'm sure I'd have to either adapt my method quite a bit or else just go right to pose-to-pose. But it works for me right now, and I really love working this way. So if you're interested in trying out new ways and want to give this one a shot, or even if you're already working similarly to this, please try this out and leave in the comments how it's working for you. Or if you're not inclined and you know you're a pose-to-pose animator, I hope that at least I've given you something to learn from, as I have learned so much from the pose-to-pose animators. I'd love to hear your comments as well. Remember to subscribe. I do tutorials every other week and entertainment every other week. As I continue to work for clients and build up IMpasto toward animated feature film, I'd love to have you along as a guest and a helper along the way. Thanks for watching, and I'm out.